the Road Wraith of Dartmoor. Dartmoor National Park is a surreal and otherworldly, almost primeval moor in Southern Devon, England. Covering 368 square miles of widely untouched wilderness, it's a strange and mystical place, with its ancient stone circles, monuments, mounds and burial sites set in evocative rolling hills where creeping mists, sudden fogs and unpredictable changes in the weather can turn it from a magical, fairy tale landscape into an eerie, dark, ominous and even hostile place. The strangeness of the landscape is further accentuated by the famous giant rock formations known as tors, which have a peculiar organic look about them, almost as if they've grown out of the landscape, with twists and folds that make some of them resemble the fossils of ancient fallen trees. Then there is the Oswell Wood rainforest near Widdicombe, known as the Lost World for its dense vegetation and rare endangered wildlife. There's the Crazy Well Pool near Princetown, the large and bottomless pond that allegedly calls out the names of those who are to die as their faces appear on the surface. And then Wistman's Wood, which resembles the setting of a misty fairy and folk tale. It's little wonder that Dartmoor has become host to numerous fables of pixies, goblins, large cats, witches, giants and ghosts over the centuries. The famous Sherlock Holmes mystery The Hound of the Baskervilles was set on these moors and was based on the true story of Squire Cabell. At the moment of the squire's death, a pack of black hounds ran howling across the moors. The squire's coffin was then sealed and kept in a tomb to prevent him from running with his ghostly pack. And there are other stories of strange and allegedly true events on the moors that defy explanation, and the most enduring of these goes back at least 200 years and continues to this very day, on a long and desolate road known as Route B3212. Once known as Carter's Road after the man who had built it, B3212 covers a distance of over 35 miles into the heart of Dartmoor. Along that road, there is an isolated 9-mile stretch between Post Bridge and two bridges, which has become infamous for a malevolent and terrifying presence and the unusual amount of accidents, including fatal accidents, that have occurred there. Stories of a strange presence along that road began in the 1800s, when travellers would claim that their horses would suddenly veer off the road or panic and bolt, sometimes kicking and smashing their carriages as they fled. Coachmen would claim that something seemed to take control of their reins, forcing them off the road into the verge. Those travelling on foot had also spoken of an ominous feeling there, and despite two bridges being a local beauty spot, it was also well known by locals to be a strange and eerie place. At the turn of the 20th century, cyclists and even drivers began reporting odd accidents along the isolated road. In many cases, the victims reported that their vehicle had suddenly jolted or violently swerved and steered off the road, as if something had taken hold of the wheel and wrenched it out of their control. Luckily, all of them escaped without serious injury. In most instances, the victims ran into the verge but came away from it shaken but unharmed. Their strange experiences remained a local curiosity. That is until March 1921, when a Dr. Ernest Helby, the medical officer for Dartmoor Prison, was killed when he lost control of his motorcycle combination. Helby's wife and 2 young girls, the children of the prison governor who were in the sidecar with her at the time, survived. As they had been approaching Post Bridge near the entrance of Archerton, the handlebars suddenly jerked to one side and the axle broke, separating the sidecar from the bike. Helby careered headlong into the ditch and was killed instantly, having suffered a fractured skull, while the sidecar came to a halt on the grassy verge. Another doctor, on holiday with his family in Cherrybrook Farm, came across the scene soon afterwards, and when he stopped to help, he said Helby's wife, in a state of shock, told him how her husband had suddenly lost control of the bike, and then she mumbled something incomprehensible about hands. In one account of this incident, one of the young girls claimed that Helby had shouted at them to jump, and that he had appeared to be wrestling for control of the bike. In another account of the incident, one of the girls reported to police that she had seen 2 large, disembodied hairy hands grab the handlebars and jolt them suddenly to one side. The girls spoke of running over to the doctor's bike after the crash, only to see the 2 large hands still holding onto the handlebars as the bike and its victim lay in the ditch. A short time later, another motorcyclist, this time with a pillion passenger, was driven off the road whilst approaching the same spot between Post Bridge and 2 bridges. The passenger insisted afterwards that he had seen a large, hairy hand grasp the handlebars and wrench the bike off balance. Within just weeks, there was another incident on the same stretch of road, in which a coach driver suddenly lost control, swerved and shot across to the other side, crashing into the bank and injuring several passengers, one of them seriously. The driver later claimed that he had felt, but did not see, a pair of hands grab the wheel and force the vehicle off the road. Then, on the 26th of August 1921, on a dull and foggy day, an army captain described as Captain M was travelling on his motorbike along the same stretch when he suddenly lost control of his bike and was thrown onto the verge. Luckily, he escaped with minor injuries, but he later reported that a pair of large hands had clamped over his and driven his motorcycle off the road. He said afterwards, "It just wasn't my fault. Believe it or not, something seemed to wrench me off the road. A huge, hairy pair of hands closed over mine on the handlebars. I felt them as plainly as ever I felt anything in my life. Large, muscular, hairy hands. I fought them for all it was worth, but they were too strong for me. They forced the machine into the turf at the edge of the road, and I knew no more until I came to, lying a few feet away on my face on the turf." Following the captain's experience, the story went from local curiosity to a nationwide sensation after being picked up by newspapers in London. Reporters began flocking to the area to investigate the strange occurrences, and many drew the conclusion that it was uneven camber on the road which had caused these accidents. But the truth is, the camber was fixed after that third accident, but the crashes and fatalities continued for decades and were accompanied by similar reports of the apparition from surviving victims. Those travelling in cars, motorbikes, bicycles and carriages all experienced or claimed to experience the same thing. There is one brief and obscure account I found of another young army officer, but this time on foot, who became lost during a training exercise in a sudden heavy fog. When he finally made it to the bridge on the road to Princetown, he felt a sudden chill and a panic, the urge to run. It was then that he felt, but didn't see, a pair of huge, powerful hands grab his throat and begin to squeeze. It was only when he fell from the bridge into the waters below that the hands let go of him. Unfortunately, there is no further detail about him, his name, or the date or year that it occurred. In 1924, Dorothy Brown, the mother of folklorist Theo Brown, was camping with her husband near the ruins of the old powder mills factory on the moor when she was woken up by the sounds of scratching and shuffling around the frame of the caravan door. Alert now, she sat bolt upright and listened intently as the scratching noises slowly moved from the door outside towards the window of the caravan. She wrote about it afterwards. I knew there was some power very seriously menacing us near. As I looked up at the small window at the end of the caravan, I saw something moving, and as I stared, I saw it was the fingers and palm of a hand with many hairs on the joints and back of it. It was clawing up and up to the top of the window, which was a little open. I knew it wished to do harm. I knew that the owner of the hand hated us and wished harm, and I knew it was no ordinary hand and that no blow or shot would have power over it. As she stared at the apparition, it continued crawling toward the opening in the window, where it then tried to get inside. She continued. Almost unconsciously, I made the sign of the cross and I prayed very much that we might be kept safe. At once the hand slowly sank out of sight and I knew the danger was gone. I did say a thank you prayer and fell at once into a peaceful sleep. We stayed in that spot for several weeks, but I never felt the evil influence again near the caravan. But I did not feel happy in some places not far off, and I would not for anything have walked alone on the moor at night or on the tor above the caravan. In September of 1947, a young couple from Exeter were visiting Princetown in their motorbike combination. As the young man had drunk a little, his girlfriend asked him to drive slowly and carefully, which he did. But as they approached Cherrywood Bridge, the motorbike began to accelerate out of control along the road. The young lady was flung out of the sidecar, but luckily landed safely on the grass verge, but the vehicle itself smashed into the nearby bridge, fatally injuring her boyfriend. The inquest afterwards found that the couple had been sober at the time of the accident, and that as they sped towards the bridge their machine had simply gone into a wobble and the young man was unable to regain control. The verdict was accidental death. In 1961, a young man went on his motorbike into Princetown to run an errand for his landlady, and returning to Penlee along the B3212, he said he had felt his hands suddenly gripped by two rough and hairy hands that made every effort to force him off his bike. He managed to wrestle and keep control of his bike, but was left very shaken by the experience. In 1962, Florence Warwick was travelling to visit family and friends in Dartmoor. As dusk began to fall, she became a little lost along this ominous stretch of road and decided to pull over in the fading light to gather her bearings. Switching off her engine, she reached for her road map, and as she was tracing her torch over the print, she began to feel a cold chill inside the car. Suddenly, she heard a dull thump on her windscreen. In her own words, I looked up and saw a pair of huge, hairy hands pressed against the windscreen. I tried to scream, but I couldn't. I was frozen with fear. She watched in horror as the hands slowly crawled along the windscreen right in front of her. Finally, she was able to let out a scream, and the apparition disappeared. She gathered her thoughts and drove on to Torbay, where she told friends of her encounter. She was surprised that they not only believed her, but told her that she had just had an encounter with the infamous Wraith of Dartmoor. In 1991, a doctor from Somerset was driving along the same part of the B3212 when he felt a strange and sudden temperature drop inside his car. He described later, "It was as if something evil was actually inside the car with me. The steering wheel went wild and was wrenched out of my hands. The car then crashed and overturned on the road, and the doctor was very lucky to survive to tell his story. Although he didn't describe seeing any hands, his encounter is otherwise identical to the others." In 2008, a man named Michael Anthony was beginning the long drive home to Bristol from a business trip in Post Bridge. It was already past 11 o'clock at night when he entered the ominous B3212. Not long into his journey, he too began to feel an icy chill inside the car, and his hands began to feel numb. Then, without warning, two large paws, as he described them, appeared in front of him and suddenly grabbed hold of his hands before trying to steer the car off the road. Frantically, he wrestled to keep control of the car and succeeded in staying on the road. The hands tried 2 more times to force him to crash, but after failing a 3rd time, they disappeared, and as they did, the car was filled with what he described as the smell of sulphur. When author Michael Williams was writing a book about Dartmoor's haunted history, he collected a story from the journalist Rufus Endell. Endell had been driving near Postbridge village when he had the encounter. He explained, "A pair of hands gripped the driving wheel, and I had to fight for control. After a frenzied struggle, he managed to barely avoid crashing, and the hands disappeared in front of him." Endell specifically requested that his account not be published until after his death. One post I came across from someone who lives in the Princetown area describes how his uncle was returning home late from the building site he worked at one evening. There was some sort of hold-up on the road that he normally uses, so he had to take a different route, which brought him through the Two Bridges area. On entering that section of road, he began to feel eerie and uncomfortable, as if he was being watched or followed. It was very dark all around. He thought he glimpsed someone at the side of the road, but when he looked again, there was no one there. Further down the road, the steering wheel suddenly went haywire, and he couldn't keep it stable, no matter how hard he tried. His eyes were fixed on the road as he tried to keep straight. Then he felt something on the wheel and looked down, and that's when he saw the hands. 2 large hands covered in hair, forcing the wheel to the side. He lost control, went up on the verge and hit the ditch hard, just missing a tree. Then the apparition disappeared. He was lucky, uninjured but badly shaken. A few minutes later, a passing motorist saw him and stopped by to help. He was okay, but shaken. This happened about 20 years ago, so sometime in the 90s, and the poster said his uncle still maintains to this day that it happened. I also recently came across another post on social media in which someone had claimed that their brother, who had spent much of his time hiking on the moors, experienced a number of weird things he couldn't explain over the years, including the infamous hands. Back in the 1980s, his brother was in his 20s He was driving his van towards Postbridge late one evening when he felt, but did not see, something very strong grab hold of the wheel and tried to steer it off the road. He immediately hit the brakes and was lucky enough to escape the incident with little more than a bruise to the head and a bad shock. There was some damage to the car, but from that day on, whenever there was condensation on the windows, a partial handprint would be apparent on the driver's side window. No amount of cleaning, scrubbing, or even car washes would remove this strange phenomenon. Eventually he sold the van, but even the person who bought it contacted him afterwards asking about the strange handprint that wouldn't go away. Since then, the poster mentioned, his brother has always avoided the Postbridge area whilst visiting Dartmoor, even if it means having to make a longer journey around. To this day, there are still reports of the hands and of a strange and sinister feeling of a presence inside the cars of those driving along the B3212. So what are the supposed origins of the hands? There are claims that the hands belong to a motorist who had been killed in a car crash along that stretch of road, losing both hands in the impact. But this would not explain the incidents that have been happening there since long before the first motor vehicle was even invented. Then there's the powder mills, which was once a gunpowder factory in the area. One story goes that a blacksmith from the powder mills factory had gone back to collect his tools after a night's drinking. Not wearing his regulation boots at the time, his old hobnail boots caused a spark on the granite floor, which ignited the gunpowder nearby and caused a devastating explosion. The only thing they found of him afterwards were his hands, both of which were known to be very big and very hairy. Whether or not this story is true, there are 3 recorded major accidents at the powder mills factory. In July 1851, a fire broke out in one of the houses at Dartmoor Powder Works, killing 1 man and injuring 3. The following morning, another explosion blew one of its buildings to smithereens, but no one was injured on that occasion. And in November 1857, there was an explosion that killed 2. But why would someone who was a normal worker in life suddenly become an evil psychotic murderer in death? The powder mills factory is now a pottery production plant. If there are any haunted incidents there, they haven't been reported to the best of my knowledge. There is also speculation that the phantom may have been the spirit of one of the many captured American sailors who died in Dartmoor prison after the War of 1812. Believe it or not, between 1813 and 1815, over 6,500 Americans were held inside Dartmoor prison after the Second War with America. When the Treaty of Ghent ended the war in 1814, the prisoners thought release would be imminent, but the treaty wasn't ratified by the US Senate until February 1815, and in the meantime, the prisoners became restless and convinced that they had been forgotten and abandoned, so they made a plan to dig their way out of the prison. The tunnel was later discovered, and 300 of them were rounded up in the courtyard, where a confrontation followed, and the guards began opening fire directly into the crowd. As the story goes, 30 prisoners managed to escape in the chaos. Of the 30 that escaped, all of them perished on the moors, but one of them did manage to make his way to the road now known as B3212, where he jumped a passing carriage, grabbed the reins, and tried to force them from the coachman's hands. The coachman managed to push him back in the struggle, and he fell back onto the road and was crushed under the wheels. We can see where this particular story fits into the paranormal legend: the grabbing of the reins to force the carriage off the road, the sudden violent death of the prisoner on the road, whose ghost presumably has been attacking and forcing vehicles off the road ever since. 268 American POWs died in Dartmoor prison during their incarceration. How many died during the shooting is still disputed. Some accounts claim that most of the 300 were killed, others that 9 Americans were killed. So what can we make of the legend of the hands? The lack of names and other specific details in many, but not all, of the accounts would prompt a little skepticism over at least the anonymous claims. But the accounts left by people who did put their names to them, particularly Rufus Endell, who was adamant that his encounter not be published until after his death, are intriguing. It's a legend as fascinating as the moor itself. And whatever your beliefs, I have to admit, if I was passing through B3212, and especially Archton, Post Bridge or Two Bridges, I would probably slow down and grip the steering wheel a little bit more tightly and make sure my foot is ready to apply the brakes. In that sense, maybe the hairy hands have been inadvertently just as responsible for saving lives as well as taking them. Well, there has been a number of theories and rationalizations surrounding the legend of the whole story of B3212. As mentioned earlier, the uneven camber on the road was one explanation, combined with drivers who were unfamiliar with the turns and bends in the road. But of course, as also mentioned earlier, the camber was fixed not long after the accident that killed Dr. Helby. The stories of eerie goings-on do go back at least 200 years, and these accidents were not just reported by people who were unfamiliar with the area or road, but also by people who lived in the area. There was one witness of a coach crash on the road who wrote to the editor of a newspaper, putting forward the theory that it was the magnetic effect of the numerous rocks in the area that was causing the accidents. But whether this is any more plausible than the theory of malevolent spirits would be a matter of opinion. Many locals have suggested that it's all down to grockles. So what exactly is a grockle? Is it a spectre that haunts the hills of Dartmoor? Is it a mischievous sprite or one of the other elfin creatures that haunt the hills? The dictionary's definition of a grockle defines it as an informal, slightly derogatory term for a holiday maker, especially one visiting a resort in Devon or Cornwall. Outsiders in Cornwall are also sometimes referred to as emmets. So, according to some locals, it may be grockles or even emmets that have strayed out of their county and found themselves driving too fast along the haunted road. So are these hands an evil wraith, the ghostly form of an ex-Dartmoor prison inmate or some kind of moor's spirit? Or are they spooky knuckles or speeding grockles, ghostly digits or ghastly emmets? You decide. For me, the most enduring and unexplainable mystery is one that hasn't been discussed yet, and that is how a stretch of road running to the very heart of one of the most scenic landscapes in the English countryside could possibly have been given the name B3212. That, to me, is a mystery and a horror that can never be properly explained. Good night, wherever you are.